The question, as ever, was how to be happy. But in 1960, if you were American, white and white collar, your chances of happiness had never seemed greater. That, at least, was the song the ad men on Madison Avenue were singing.
I love your eyes, the way they smile. I love your hair, the way it glows just like the sun, the midnight sun product.
Hey, that's a great track.
Way up.
Americans in 1960 were a people of plenty. Their national character molded by the experience and the expectation of abundance. To understand this America, what it was and what it might become, Madison Avenue was the place to look.
When I run a campaign, I expected the country to look at that advertising and go, wow, boom, and talk about it the next day, and then buy it.
Sheer deception.
Madison Avenue was the chorus line of capitalism. The people who worked there could shift not just products, but the whole culture by working the levers of America's dreams and desires.
We sit down with this woman, whether it be print or television or radio, and we say to her very simply, we understand you, we sympathize with you. And she says, my God, that's how I really feel.
Ah, that was just terrific. I print that one. Absolutely beautiful.
I understand the culture, and I understand how to go ahead of the culture. I understand how to pull a culture with me. I'm trying to break through and say it's a new kind of America we should be building.
We stand today on the edge of a new frontier, the frontier of the 1960s.
On the frontier of this new decade, the challenges of feminism, Vietnam, and the counterculture still lay in the future. New York's International Airport was still called Idlewild. And there was a giant billboard for Hertz Rent-A-Car on top of the Texas School Book Depository in Dallas. The question, as ever, was how to be happy. Not, how long will this happiness last? America in 1960 was a land of plenty. From the commercial breaks to the pages of the weekly magazines, a cornucopia of favourite things was on offer. The Bible for this consumer's republic was the Sears mail-order catalogue, which in 1960 weighed in at £4 and contained more than 1,500 pages of products, from abdominal bands to zippers.
I'm looking at my whole wardrobe from the 60s. I see styles and shirts and the kind of look that I was involved in back then. You know, you could get anything from a Sears catalog. It covered American life, and for me, it's a kind of archaeology of the culture.
The key word for this culture was affluence.
Affluence was fullness. Money moving, goods flowing, energy chugging, America's moving, rolling. It had nothing but goodness rolling out of it. There was no suggestion that there could ever be too much affluence.
But even as America accelerated into the affluent 60s, the bad old days of the Second World War and the Great Depression still loomed large in the rearview mirror.
promise, the fullness of affluence was often seen in relation to the Great Depression. It was the end of the arc that led from the Great Depression. So where we were then collectively in the soup, then collectively without, now we were collectively with.
The America we live in has enough bounty and goodness for everyone, and so much of that goodness goes into Arnold brick oven bread. Milk, honey, table butter.
This sense of collective well-being suggested that capitalism's promise of a land of milk and honey for all might actually be realized.
What you had seen really in the space of maybe 15 years was just an incredible generation of wealth and also an incredible sort of diffusion of prosperity, generalized prosperity, to most of the country. What you had seen was really the creation of a true prosperous middle class.
People identified themselves as middle class, and the spread between the rich and the poor, while obviously not erased, was, by comparison with the present, relatively shallow. There are obviously enormous social differences, especially between whites and blacks, but it was easier to feel that we were in the same boat. There was first class and there was steerage, but it was still the same boat.
And now for a look at the Soviet consumer.
And if anyone had any doubts about the superiority of the American way, there was always Brand X to compare it to.
A package of cornflakes is the subject of a Soviet film which looks like one of our less inspired TV commercials. Comrades, do you suffer from loss of freedom? Do everyday worries like the secret police bother you? Then try our Kremlin flakes. They're corny.
Consumer culture is the engine of democracy, the engine that is driving what was then the most popular term for this, democratic capitalism, capital D, capital C.
America.
That is the notion of liberating Americans, of giving them choices, that we had freedom that the Russians didn't, and that freedom is best experienced through our ability to choose among a variety of consumer goods.
America.
Armed with cheap mortgages and low-interest loans, Americans were encouraged to resist the spread of communism by surrendering to the rapture of consumption.
All kinds of hardware and machinery for the home, motorcycles and kitchen appliances. I mean, look, page after page of lawnmowers. It goes on and on. Look at the shapes and the variety of an object called a shovel. Americans grew up understanding that was part of our birthright, in a way. Our cultural heritage was that in this free enterprise democracy, you have 60 shovels to choose from. And because there's a reason for everyone, this is right. Seems like a good thing.
First choice in television, RCA Victor TV.
The greatest driver of consumption was itself the object of consumers' greatest desires, the television. If the Sears mail-order catalogue was their Bible, television was the altar on which daily miracles were witnessed.
I remember people standing outside stores looking at the new television sets. When color TV appeared, especially, television had a peculiar prestige and a magic associated with it. And so it was something a family might do on a Sunday. Take the subway down to Rockefeller Center, where RCA was located, and you'd walk into the RCA building and you'd see the new gadgets. That was fun.
A campaign for Motorola from the early 60s shows how the desires of consumers were amplified with ads that danced along the borderline between reality and dreams.
In advertising in the late 50s and 60s, illustration held sway. It was much stronger than most photography. It was fantasized. I mean, the illustrator could put in everything. They just would tell the guy, could you give me this ottoman over here in this color, and could you put the waterfall in? So he could do it. I mean, and people aspired to this.
The Motorola artist was Charles Shriddy. Though he lived and worked in grimy old Detroit, his elaborate lifestyle fantasies were pure California. Some of Shriddy's most seductive scenes play out in a suburban paradise, where manicured lawns butt up against the wall-to-wall carpeting, with only a picture window to separate them.
The suburb represents a kind of artificial paradise for the Americans who can afford it. The shrines of suburbia are the private homes and the driveways to them and the garages in them and the carports next to them and, of course, the stuff inside them. The vantage that matters in the suburbs is the view through the private picture window. It's not the city hall. It's not the courthouse. The suburb belongs to the nuclear family. And the seasons, which had once been strictly associated with nature, have come to be associated with consumer goods, issued routinely at certain fixed times of the year. And so the year gets remade around the rhythms of consumer goods.
What we need in our car is what do you call it? An integrated powertrain.
You of all people, Mom, know that we simply cannot afford anything but...
Pop, we don't buy the lowest price of everything we get.
Other people seem to be able to progress, to keep stepping up a little as they get older. That's a very important thing to a family, Oliver.
Okay, Mom. We're the Joneses. Let them keep up with us.
In 1960, one of the more exciting new products for the Joneses of America to consider was called JFK.
There was something about the 1960 election that reflected the zeitgeist, that reflected the changing times. And I think JFK is an almost perfect symbol of that.
He put out the right ideal. He was, quote unquote, selling for me the right thing. Whether he would ultimately deliver, the poor guy never had the chance to prove himself, but he was saying the right things.
My call is to the young in heart, regardless of age, to the stout in spirit, regardless of party, to all who respond to the scriptural call, be strong and of good courage, be not afraid.
We suddenly had this young, attractive, powerful guy who spoke well, and he gave everyone a sense of hope.
Kennedy had declared his bid for the White House on the 11th of January, 1960, but not before some last-minute tinkering with the ingredients.
He had what they call a boyish forelock. Okay, he had sort of a mass of curls, if you will, and it was much more unkempt. And when he decided to run for president, the forelock was gone, and they sculpted his hair more into that sort of what we think was the Kennedy-esque helmet, which was supposed to make him look older and more dignified and give him an air of gravitas.
His style was very new. It was very cool. There was a cool style to it. That although he was young and fresh, there was also something kind of restrained about him.
You can see the change that television brought. Before TV, how did you campaign? You went to strangers, you put your arm around them, you kissed their babies, you touched them. If you look at someone like Lyndon Johnson, there are pictures of him in people's faces, very physical with them. Kennedy hated that. He hated kissing babies and all that sort of thing. He didn't like the intimacy that was forced upon him. And so he was this cool man of detachment.
One way in which Kennedy expressed his individuality and protected his trademark bouffant hairdo was by refusing to don the emblem of all red-blooded, white-collared American males, the fedora.
John F. Kennedy wanted people to see him. If you look at the few photographs of Kennedy wearing a hat, you can't see that he's there. Without the hat, he has this wonderful edifice of chestnut hair. It's a trademark. People called it a trademark at the time. And you can instantly see that's John F. Kennedy. When you see a picture of him with a hat, you can barely tell it's him.
But for some, hatless Jack was a nightmare. This was a man whose use of straight-back rocking chairs or cigars led to an immediate spike in sales. JFK was a walking billboard. For the hat makers of America, a hatless JFK was a marketing disaster, and getting one on his head became a major preoccupation.
Kennedy photographer in his memoir said, hat salesmen dogged our route. Okay, so they'd show up in a town, and the guy from the local hat store would try to make Kennedy wear a hat.
I've just been presented this hat, but I don't have the guts to wear it quite yet. I got to stay in Texas about 3 more days before I'll...
And it was sort of this game people would play. You see constantly people trying to slap one on his head, and him trying to sort of squirm out from under it. He had magic and charisma, and everyone wanted part of that.
I'm going to wear this in the St. Patrick's Day Parade in Boston.
I, Fitzgerald Kennedy, do solemnly swear.
I, John Fitzgerald Kennedy.
In January 1961, victorious and hatless, JFK took the oath of office. The words new, anew, and renewal appeared 11 times in his inaugural speech.
The torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans in a new alliance for progress, signifying renewal. We renew our pledge of support to strengthen its shield of the new and the weak, that both sides begin anew the quest for peace. So let us begin anew, a new endeavor, not a new balance of power, but a new world of law.
Confessions of an Advertising Man by creative director David Ogilvy came out that same month. In it, Ogilvy observed, "The two most powerful words you can use in a headline are free and new. You can seldom use free, but you can almost always use new."
Of the great new technical advances
on new cars, whole new communities.
Wonderful new world of push-button cooking.
In 1960, New York was also in the business of renewal. It was shedding its skin and building an economic and iconic supremacy it hadn't enjoyed since the 1930s.
New York was undergoing one of its greatest building booms in its history. There had been almost nothing built in the way of commercial office space in New York, with the exception of Rockefeller Center. So there was this pent-up need for a huge amount of new office space. As a result, whole new avenues were rebuilt, it seemed overnight.
New York was being renewed. You could hardly take any kind of stroll through the streets of the city without having your thoughts invaded by the sound of iron balls whacking against some stone wall here or there. Buildings went up with such speed. First of all, you see excavations, you see the bulldozers, the earth is being dug up, and then
You come back a month later and there was steel, and then a month later there was glass, and people were running elevators up and down. It was almost instant. Buildings 50, 60 stories high were almost up in a matter of weeks, it seemed.
Park Avenue and 3rd Avenue and 6th Avenue were torn down, and block after block were transformed into high-rise, modern office structures in the international style.
Modern castles of business and industry, built of glass, aluminum, steel, plastics, ceramics. They are soundproofed, air-conditioned, modular.
There was almost something narcissistic about these glass skyscrapers, office buildings. You could see from the sidewalk almost what was going on inside. You could see desks, you could see, of course, the good-looking secretaries, and you could see what represented American business culture, such as it was. And you could see there was a transparency, there was a narcissism, there was a reflection. It was smooth and open. It advertised itself.
Lever House, just across the street from us here, was the first commercial glass and steel office building in the world. And that really was a landmark building in every sense of the word. It gave a new image to the modern city. And then the final word on it, so to speak, the most elegant example would be the building we're sitting in, which is the Seagram building. This was a kind of mesmerizing vision of the new America, the new post-war superpower, now putting out its power not through military force, but through what we would call soft power, influence, a kind of a seductive vision of what the future could be. Here was this spectacular, fresh urban architecture that seems to portend a kind of a clean, new, bright world of what post-war urban life is going to be like. Really kind of an optimistic idea of a civil, peaceful, global economic order that was being developed right then and there in New York.
The transformation of New York prompted Time magazine in 1962 to wax lyrical.
On a winter's evening, when the dusk drops suddenly, and the lights go on in 1,000 offices against the twilight sky, the thrusting towers of Manhattan become a sight like nothing else on earth. Having some of the presumed radiance of an Aladdin's cave, something of the misty, suspended magic of an underwater seascape, and an unearthly grandeur of scale that suggests a fantasy of hell or an angular heaven.
The stars of this brave new world were the ad men of Madison Avenue. People like George Lewis, who on the 1st of January 1960 opened a new ad agency on the 28th floor of the Seagram building, the most spectacular example of the new modern office block.
I was the only guy ever in this business who promised I would do a campaign that would knock America on its ass. You know, immediately. I mean, the next morning. If it wasn't the next morning, I'd say, what the hell happened?
Ensconced in their towers of glass and steel, and buttressed by their own supreme self-confidence, ad men like Lewis addressed corporate America on equal terms, trading on their inside track to the hearts and minds of the American consumer.
If I got an idea and I got it and I understood it and I thought it was hip, or whatever the word is, I think the rest of America would get it. Everybody thought Xerox was an antifreeze.
Sam, will you please go make a copy of this?
I got the account. I went to them and I wanted to do a TV commercial. And, what are you talking about? I said, well, you could be famous tomorrow morning with one commercial.
Thank you, Sam. That was fast.
That says even a monkey can do it, and what happened literally is their 15-year plan was accomplished in 6 months.
Which one's the original?
By 1960, what you've really seen is the emergence of the ad man as national hero is definitely not the right word, but certainly as someone who had become central to the way Americans thought about what consumer society looked like, and certainly what they thought capitalism looked like.
I think the advertising man is in a certain sense unique because he's probably part artist, part businessman, part scientist, I guess.
He's kind of the embodiment of this new ethos, the new man, the sort of young, hip.
I'm saying which will give you a better light effect, won't it, if it goes in?
The idea of Madison Avenue as a kind of location, like this was the place to be, this is where everything important is happening.
God, I'm tripping through the daisies.
So advertising was suddenly seen as both the most powerful, the most lucrative, and, for lack of a better word, the sexiest business around.
Roll!
These advertising men suddenly found themselves a kind of iconic position in American culture and the American imagination as they never had been before.
Introducing chicken tetrazzini, lasagna, and manigot. Some people think it's the cast of a Dolce Vita.
He was the kind of quintessential new American. He was the new post-war American.
Introducing lasagna. Some people think it's an Italian opera.
Dark suits, thin ties, white shirts, a whole language that everybody spoke.
Let's start with chicken tetrazzini.
Let's run it up the flagpole and see who salutes. Let's throw it against the wall and see what sticks.
Where did chicken tetrazzini originate?
It might have originated in Brooklyn for all I know.
They lived in the suburbs, and specifically in Westchester in Connecticut, the more upper-class suburbs of New York. A place like Westport, Connecticut, that was the one that all the creative guys lived in. Mad Magazine used to mock the 504 to Westport, you know, and they all had to catch the 504 to Westport and have their martini in the train.
There was sportiveness in the air. The men were into looking good, wearing great suits, drinking 2 or 3 martinis at lunch. You have these good-looking young women, not long removed from universities, working in advertising agencies. They were not working in the newspaper profession. I, as a New York Times reporter, rarely saw an attractive woman, but they were in advertising, and they represented glamour insofar as the working woman concerned.
Hello, amigo. I'm Chiquita Banana.
I was the Chiquita Banana girl. You know, we'd do cartoons in comic books or whatever, selling things, and we were selling Chiquita Banana in cartoons.
You can put them in a salad.
Advertising, to me, was so identified with comedy or sprightliness or cheerfulness and nothing particularly serious that it reached me because I was always sort of a nut. So I loved doing it. I knew I was a good writer. I'd been writing since way back in childhood. And it just seemed like a lively, happy place. You just had to kind of keep away from the guys. At least I did. I was cute in those days. So they used to knock on my cubicle, so to speak. You want to have lunch? No.
This is the main dining room. It's called the pool room of the Four Seasons. You get the guns here, you know. Editorial people, business people, important city people, but all the shakers and movers of New York, all kinds of people. I ate lunch here for 40 years, every day, 9,762 times.
It was hedonism. It was this, I think advertising was very much an industry that had imbued a great deal of hedonism within the workforce, within the hours of work.
There was a lot of fun and games. a lot of hanky-panky, all to ease the pressure of getting the job done. There was one guy who had a barber's chair in his office, and he used to boast how he could pick up women in the elevator at noontime, get them into his barber's chair and have a really delightful time, before 2 o'clock even rolled around and work started. One agency opened a bar, and all you had to do was to call your wife and tell her, hey, I've got this deadline and just been slammered by this account man and I got to get it out tomorrow, and you're probably in some hotel room somewhere.
But it wasn't all fun and games on the Avenue. Like the rest of America in 1960, the ad business was going through a period of rapid change and a reconsideration of what it was there for. The joke among ad men was, if we had a soul, we'd be searching it.
I think that the business is populated by a lot of phony, freeloading, second-guessers.
There's a new cereal that tastes so right, makes you dance, it's a way out of sight.
Who couldn't make it in certain other fields.
It's tasty little squares of malted wheat.
And have retreated to this sort of where talk is cheap and able to get by in a lot of nothing.
It's crispy and it's crunchy and it tastes so neat. Faster though. Right. I'm singing it slowly actually.
There was such a antipathy between the creative people and the account executives.
We cannot cast him as a problem character. He is absolutely too good looking.
Oh, come on. We're going to have a fight. Who wants to
They were so rigid and tied to schedules, and their asses were all on the line. And the creatives who wanted to do brilliant, wonderful, fabulous things.
He could deliver the product, sell beautifully.
But you cannot have the guy with the problem be the other.
Yes,
you cannot.
That was the only scratchy part of the whole business.
At the root of all this scratchiness was the American consumer, a far harder nut to crack now than in the 1950s. Ad men lived or died by their ability to know what America wanted. But after decades of being sold to, consumers were getting wise to every move in the Madison Avenue playbook.
Meet the happy cliches in a typical family situation, knee-deep in togetherness. You can always spot the cliches by their trademark, the toothy smile. Mrs. Cliche is always found in the kitchen next to her washing machine. Her uniform, shirt-waist dress, half apron, smile.
Good morning, I'm Marion Drone from Mary Young Associates. We're doing
One way to keep consumers on side was by working out what they really wanted through research.
With light held constant, you get changes in the constriction and dilation of the pupil of the eye, which correlate to the emotional value or the interest with which people view visual or hear auditory stimuli. And what we found was that male respondents, and of course we purposely only tested male respondents, had a dramatic increase in pupil response for this particular segment of the commercial.
The Dr. Strangelove of the Madison Avenue boffins was Ernst Dichter, the inventor of motivational research.
Ernst Dichter, the Viennese psychoanalyst who comes to the United States and turns himself into the great magician of the consumer economy by really, at least in his mind, what he was doing was figuring out why Americans really wanted to buy things, and therefore allowing corporations to tailor their products or tailor their advertising to appeal to the deepest desires of Americans.
What we're going to do is try a couple of these salad dressings.
Do you know what I think this is? Yeah. This would be the compromise for a woman feeling creative.
I think that it has a place in our American way of life.
He was a therapist. He saw in Americans this long tradition of Puritanism or puritanical attitude towards consumer culture. So he offered a vision of a consumer culture that was anti-puritanical.
Modern man quite often tries to work off his frustrations by spending on self-gratification. Modern man is eternally ready to fill out his self-image by purchasing products which complement it.
Dichter, through advertising, would help Americans overcome this repression and indulge themselves fully in a sexualized consumer culture.
I think of Dichter mostly as a crank. You know, the examples are hilarious because maybe they're hilarious because they're true.
Well, there's the car I told you about. Just take a look at it from here for a minute. Do you like it?
Yeah, it's sure smooth. That car's got scat.
He noticed that men came into the automobile showroom and leaned up against a convertible, but then bought a sedan. And through conversations with men and women, what he learned was that men thought of the convertible as their mistress.
The lines of the car are plenty smooth. They're extra soft.
On the other hand, the sedan was their wife.
You said yesterday, Mrs. Jones, that you take your sister's little boy out for rides in the car.
And he then developed from that two recommendations. One was that showrooms be designed to highlight the presence of the convertible. And the other one was to develop a compromise between a convertible and a sedan so men could fantasize about a mistress and have the comfort of their wives.
It's all well and good, but Ernest is missing a big point.
The point was that there was more than one way to sell a car. For those who believed that advertising was more art than science, the answer to the problem of the wised-up consumer was nothing less than a creative revolution. And the banner of revolution would first be raised in the pages of Life magazine.
Life magazine was the news of the week. You could see the most important events in black and white and color that happened in the world in that week. Life had photographers who they would send out to make these essays, and they would bring back something that was very personal. It was their take on it. It was television before television was as powerful and far-reaching as it is right now.
Oh yeah, Life was it. You know, that's where you wanted to run your advertising. And you got ads in Life, that was hot shit. I mean, that was the ultimate.
One of the things about Life magazine that was so great was the space. It's a little billboard in your hand. You know, no magazine was as big as this. So you could have these giant ads. I mean, and they paid a pretty penny for these spaces too.
Life may have provided the perfect frame for advertising, but the things that were going in the frame were giving some ad men heartburn.
But the most advertising, and looking at most of it, it was what I called a homogenized blur. You know, you couldn't differentiate it. It just wasn't there to be differentiated. And there was a huge problem of sameness. And the sameness led to one other thing, which was really, you could die from it, was boredom.
What came before the creative revolution, it was copy heavy. While there were visuals, usually the visuals were diminished by the copy. The copywriter would write a large hunk of copy, and then the art director would be responsible for making it fit. He was a layout person, basically.
You can't say it doesn't catch your eye. It's a big, juicy double spread. But look, the guy has to go hunting to have a reason to drive off the road. And he brings his wife with him, who's actually telling him, hey, you idiot, over there, can't you see the pheasant? Where, honey, where? You know, my head's still spinning from the smell of fresh naugahyde in my car.
Forget about the content, forget about the big idea. As you turn the page, you're yawning.
Wow. This is the beginning of the end of conventional advertising.
Lemon. This Volkswagen missed the boat. The chrome strip on the glove compartment is blemished and must be replaced.
Think small. Our little car isn't so much of a novelty anymore. The guy at the gas station doesn't ask where the gas goes. Nobody even stares at our shape.
That little tiny car, Lemon, you know, think small. Nobody dared to do that. Y&R had Chrysler, and we were doing boring advertising with colorful cars with dogs and cats and women running around, etc.
Never. We'd no sooner make an overchromed, two-toned Volkswagen than we'd change the classic Beetle shape. It's not that the chromed version looks so bad. It just doesn't make the car work any better.
Nobody wanted a small car. And along comes a car that's small, so what are you going to say? So what happens is, in reverse, it says think small, and it got everybody to fall in love with the bug.
The spark that ignited the creative revolution was struck by Bill Bernbach of the agency Doyle Dane Bernbach.
You go into an American subway and watch people reading magazines and flipping through these pages at $50,000 a clip, and you begin to understand when I say that you are very practical if you have the artistry to stop people and make them look.
You want to shoot it in Paris, you wild.
Dispensing with traditional hierarchies, Bernbach teamed art directors with copywriters and put them on equal terms.
We don't tip our hand till the very end.
What Bernbach did is he said, hey, the graphic guy, the art director, is as important as the writer. And that changed everything.
Bill Bernbach said, okay, create. Develop something that hadn't been developed before. Make art out of this commerce. And go up to the line. Don't go over the line. It can't be inaccessible. But it should be something that challenges the viewer's sensibility. Makes the viewer feel like they're part of the advertisement instead of just being hawked to.
In 1959, George Lois had gone to the Volkswagen plant in Germany to get ideas for a new campaign.
We came back, and I'm walking down the hallway, and I see Bill Bernbach, the great Bill Bernbach. And he said, George, and I said, I got it. He said, you got the advertising? I said, no, I don't have the advertising, but I got the marketing problem figured out. He said, what's that? I said, Bill, we have to sell a Nazi car in a Jewish town.
How do you sell a Nazi car in a Jewish town? Well, they managed to do that. And they managed to do it through wit and irony, and doing something that advertising clients were afraid to do. How could you make fun of something?
We were the new kids in town. We weren't the establishment. We weren't the waspy, fake sons of bitches, who get their accounts playing golf,
You started getting the ethnic neighborhood kids going to art school, young Italian guys and Irish guys and Jewish kids. And suddenly they were bursting out of these art schools, and they were bringing their practical education to the advertising world.
And they were more boisterous, they were louder, they were more funny.
You get Doyle Dane Bernbach. I mean, it's an Irishman and a Jewish guy, right? And you get other, Scally McCabe and Sloves, an Irishman, an Italian, and a Jewish guy. I mean, it's like they suddenly started becoming more ethnic and tougher.
I don't know, I went in with punch-in-the-mouth advertising. They used to call it street talk. It was New York. It was the voice of New York.
You're some tomato. We could make beautiful Bloody Marys together. I'm different from those other fellas.
I like you, Wolf Schmidt. You've got taste.
And I did that sexy stuff with the Wolf Schmidt, with the bottle, looking like it was going to have sex with the orange.
You sweet doll, I appreciate you. I've got taste. I'll bring out the real orange in you. I'll make you famous. Kiss me.
Who was that tomato I saw you with last week?
That witty, sweet, funny stuff, and that changed and that stuff would get picked up by the Johnny Carsons of the world. And they would talk about it and show it and reflect on it.
Who are you calling a tomato? Wolf Schmidt is mine. He's got taste.
Of course he has taste. Wasn't he with me last night? Look at me, Wolf Schmidt. You know your onions. Let's make great martinis together.
What dolls? If only I wasn't having a drink with that lemon tonight.
The big idea advertising, the creative revolution advertising, they wanted to virally get into the culture. We now call it viral advertising, and it's supposedly a whole different thing, but it's not really. But they would create slogans, they would create jingles, they would create an aesthetic that became part of the culture, so that what you did on a daily basis was somehow influenced by the advertising.
I understand the culture, and I understand how to go ahead of the culture. I understand how to pull a culture with me.
Of course. Remember, there's an inherent beauty in soup cans that Michelangelo could not have imagined existed.
Talkative Andy Warhol and Gabby Sonny Liston always fly Braniff.
I used to say I want to be 13 weeks ahead of, only want to be 13 weeks ahead of the culture, which was the length of a TV cycle, you know. I do not want to be Leonardo da Vinci, who was a real dummy, because think about it, 300 years ahead of his time. What could you do with it, you know?
Thanks for flying Braniff, fellows.
When you got it, flaunt it.
Braniff International. When you got it, flaunt it.
This notion of getting it, is it's like hipster inside stuff. Jazz, you get it or you don't get it. Certain kind of jokes, you get it or you don't get it. Painting, you get it or you don't get it. You're in or you're out. You're cool or you're square.
The advertising was saying to people, there are some of you out there who really are going to understand this. And we're going to give you these clues, and you're going to enjoy it. Then there are other people, probably the mass, but who knows, who are not, but they'll come along because that's what happens. They'll be lemmings and they'll follow the leader.
Why?
I don't think it's that Ad Men changed everything. I think it's just that they're part and parcel of the broader cultural shifts that are already beginning to happen.
What?
The sense of there's a whole audience out there that people didn't know was out there, and it really was.
That kind of hipness and awareness is how the culture advances.
Cheese.
By any means necessary.
And that's what happened in the 60s. It was the first time they were putting the pressure on the pedal to make this idea of getting it become part of the insider's line. And advertising is really the engine of that. It created it.
What?
There are periods when ideas are fallow. There's a kind of nothing happening for a while. People are afraid to make a move. And then finally, it just bursts, right? And the 60s was, from what I could experience as my coming of age, that was a bursting time.
But despite all the optimism and positive energy of the period, nagging doubts were never far from the surface. Everyone had their own personal bugbear. The population explosion, juvenile delinquency, pollution, nuclear Armageddon. In the midst of plenty, there seemed to be an echoing emptiness. Even the usually upbeat Time magazine caught the general mood of unease in 1961.
Anxiety seems to be the dominant fact of modern life. It shouts in the headlines, laughs nervously at cocktail parties, nags from advertisements, speaks suavely in the boardroom, and whispers in the privacy each day before the shaving mirror and the dressing table.
Almost any innocent, everyday act betrays anxiety. The limp or over-hearty handshake, the second pack of cigarettes, or the third martini, the forgotten appointment, the wasted hour before the TV set, the new car unpaid for.
It could be argued that America had talked itself into it. Since the early 1950s, a series of scathing studies of the American way of life had become national bestsellers. It was a bonfire of the vanities in print form.
Galbraith's Affluent Society touches on this anxiety about a world in which
private affluence is juxtaposed to public squalor.
Hidden Persuaders, it was an expose of the methods that advertisers were using to trick Americans into buying things.
I mean, The Lonely Crowd is, now we're in a world where basically men are obsessed with what people around them think. They want to look good in the eyes of others.
Status seekers showed the way in which advertisers developed products that would intensify Americans' sense of status and get them to achieve a higher status through consumer culture.
John Keats's Crack in the Picture Window is a kind of indictment of sort of the fresh air slums of suburbia, conceived in greed, nurtured in error.
Wastemakers is really the first of a series of very important books that awaken Americans to the dangers of consumer culture, to the environment.
The Organization Man is all about how we're not individualistic enough, people don't think enough, everyone's obsessed with how they look in the eyes of their neighbors and all this stuff.
Together, these books offer a trenchant, powerful, and very influential critique of a country that was losing its moorings, that was no longer adhering to a sense of self-restraint, where hard work had been undermined, and where people were, with the encouragement of Madison Avenue, were chasing the false gods of consumer culture.
Beat poet Allen Ginsberg had seen it all coming in his 1955 vision of an America enthralled to the idol of consumerism that he called Moloch.
Moloch, Moloch, nightmare of Moloch, Moloch the loveless, mental Moloch, Moloch the heavy judger of men, Moloch whose eyes are 1,000 blind windows, Moloch whose skyscrapers stand in the long streets like endless Jehovahs, Moloch whose factories dream and croak in the fog, Moloch whose smokestacks and antennae crown the cities, Moloch, Moloch, robot apartments, invisible suburbs, skeleton treasuries, blind capitals, demonic industries, spectral nations, invincible madhouses, granite cocks, monstrous bombs. Visions, omens, hallucinations, miracles, ecstasies, gone down the American river, dreams, adorations, illuminations, religions, the whole boatload of sensitive bullshit.
In 1962, it seemed as if Moloch had materialized in Midtown Manhattan in the shape of a 2.5 million square foot, 58-story high-rise. It was only 4 years since the elegant, idealistic Seagram building had opened. But this new building conveyed a very different message about the future.
Well, the optimism that had accompanied the early 60s began to sour fairly quickly. And I think one great example of that would be the development and construction of the Pan Am building. It was despised. There was no one who had a good word for it. Some people hated it more, some people hated it less, but no one liked it. It was just a disaster. It closed off what had been one of the loveliest views in all of New York, the view down Park Avenue. It was seen as a deeply antisocial kind of building, which was ironic because it had been designed by, in part at least, by one of the great masters of the modern movement, Walter Gropius. Gropius had founded the Bauhaus, and if one thing the Bauhaus stood for, it was for socially responsible architecture. And here he was building the most socially irresponsible building being built on the planet at the time. And it was sort of like, well, what gives, Walter? And the answer was, you know, it was all hypocrisy. This kind of social mission to this modern architecture, that it was really turning out to be just an envelope, a style of envelope for these massive new commercial structures. And it did then, in a way, say something larger, which was that this stylish, new, optimistic architecture that had emerged in Park Avenue in the late 50s and early 60s, which seemed to be a symbol of hope and optimism and this new civil society and this global economy and all of this stuff, it was nonsense. It was just the side effect. These were big, massive real estate developments built to be the homes of enormous, massive, world-shaping corporate companies which existed to please their shareholders and keep their stock prices up and make a lot of money. And that's all this economy was about. This was a kind of a juggernaut moving through the world that was going to do what it was going to do. And sometimes you might like what it looked like. Other times you wouldn't. In neither case would you really be able to do anything about it. And I think that was a kind of a splash in the face for people who realized that, oh gee, what is this new world that we're creating?
Here comes the president.
No, we know that you don't wear a hat.
November 22nd, he woke up in Fort Worth, and he had this luncheon at the Fort Worth Chamber of Commerce where he was presented this Shady Oaks cowboy hat, which was their big tradition.
We couldn't let you leave Fort Worth without providing you with some protection against the rain.
And 2,000 Texans there howled for him to put it on.
Put it on in the White House on Monday. If you'll come up there, you'll have a chance to see it there.
There was no Monday for him.
President Kennedy arrived at Dallas's Love Field Airport in one of his trademark two-button suits. Jackie Kennedy's pink suit was from Chez Ninon of Park Avenue. They were driven from the airport in an open-top 1961 Lincoln Continental. On Dealey Plaza, Abraham Zapruder was waiting with a Bell & Howell Zomatic 8mm camera. In the Texas School Book Depository, Lee Harvey Oswald held a Mannlicher rifle, obtained mail order from Klein's Sporting Goods, Chicago.
Good evening. CBS News has brought you up to date on the events of this terrible day. CBS, and indeed the whole nation, is changing its habits as a result of today's activities. There will be no commercial programming, no entertainment programming on CBS, television or radio until after the funeral of the president.
For 3 days following the assassination, no commercials were shown on American television. After the funeral, normal services were resumed.
Milk chocolate toasted almonds. Don't find out by accident.
Crisscross center stretching. Sheer deception.
Great. Tilt-away steering wheel.
Even the blocks are brighter.
Something intimate is going on.
Can't talk to them.